Tuesday morning. Willow Creek Estates. Two men in fake police vests grab my arms. Neighbors freeze on their porches. Phones half raised. I don't scream. I just smile. Because a black van across the street has been rolling since sunrise. Somewhere behind her curtains, Deborah Kowalski's smile starts to crack. She thinks this is the day she finally wins. She has no idea who she just put on camera. My name is Maya Reyes, and to everyone in Willow Creek Estates, I am a freelance graphic designer who works from home, waters her tomato plants on Sundays, and keeps mostly to herself. That version of me is real. It is just not the only version. I moved into the beige two-story on Larkspur Lane 11 months ago. Alone except for my cat, Radar. Neighbors saw a quiet single woman with good manners and a tidy porch. What they could not see was the badge locked in my closet safe. Willow Creek Estates looks like a postcard. Matching mailboxes, trimmed hedges, a community pool with a strict 8 p.m. curfew. Neighborhood that sells itself on order. Order, I would learn, was Deborah Kowalski's entire religion. Deborah had been HOA president for 6 years running, unopposed every election because, as she liked to say, somebody has to protect what we've built. She wore linen blazers even to take out the trash and drove a white SUV with a vanity plate that read Board 1. The first time I met her, she showed up on my porch with a clipboard and a tape measure, informing me my mailbox post was 2 inches shorter than the community standard. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. Her face told me it was not. I remember standing there holding my coffee, genuinely unsure whether to laugh or apologize, before realizing she expected neither, only immediate, unquestioning compliance. Rules keep us civilized. Ms. Reyes, she said, snapping a photo of my mailbox for the file. I would come to learn that Deborah kept a file on every house, every resident, every infraction, real or invented, going back years. Her husband, Frank Kowalski, ran something called Kowalski Property Advisors out of a small office downtown. Neighbors assumed it managed rentals. He drove a new truck every year and never seemed short on cash, which nobody questioned out loud in a neighborhood built on politeness. My actual reason for being in Willow Creek had nothing to do with mailboxes. I was working a long federal investigation into a shell network called Meridian Holdings, suspected of laundering money through small property management fronts across 3 counties. My cover was simply to watch and wait. I chose this house because it was quiet, unremarkable, and 3 doors down from a company I needed to observe without anyone noticing me watching. Deborah Kowalski was, first, nothing more to me than a mildly irritating neighbor with a clipboard fetish. The HOA newsletter, which Deborah wrote personally every month, read less like community news and more like a legal decree. Violations were listed by address, never by name, though everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly whose lawn had been shamed that week. Some residents joked, quietly, that Deborah's newsletter had more legal weight in Willow Creek than the actual county code, and nobody laughed too loudly when they said it. I kept my landscaping tidy out of habit, not fear. Still, within a month, I had 2 friendly reminders in my mailbox. One about the color of my porch light bulb, another about a garden gnome a friend had gifted me as a joke. "It's not personal," said Pam Ellis, my next-door neighbor, the first time we spoke over the fence. Pam had lived there 9 years and knew every unwritten rule. Deborah just likes things a certain way. You'll get used to it, or you'll leave. Pam had a nervous habit of glancing toward the Kowalski house whenever she talked about Deborah, like she was checking to see if her words might somehow be overheard. At the time, I thought it was simple small-town caution. I filed it away anyway. Old habits. Deborah's power came from more than a title. She sat on the architectural committee, controlled the reserve fund, and had personally recruited most of the board members who worked. Conveniently, from lists she curated herself. Nobody ran against her because nobody wanted the headache. One evening, coming back from a surveillance shift I could not explain to anyone, I noticed the black van from Meridian's warehouse idling 2 streets over, its plates matching a name flagged in my case file. My cover life and my real one were closer than I liked. I sat in my car afterward longer than necessary, watching the van's taillights fade, reminding myself that coincidence and connection were not always the same thing. I kept a burner phone in my kitchen drawer for calls to my handler, Agent Kessler, always at odd hours, always brief. If Deborah had ever wondered why the quiet graphic designer stepped outside to talk on the phone at 11 at night, she never asked. By my 3rd month, I understood the neighborhood's real currency was fear dressed up as etiquette. People paid their fines quickly, avoided eye contact at board meetings, and thanked Deborah for keeping standards high, even as she fined a widow for a wind chime. I tried to stay invisible, the way any good agent learns to. Blend in, keep your head down, don't give anyone a reason to look twice. For 11 months, it worked. Then Deborah decided my backyard vegetable garden violated the community's uniform aesthetic clause. The letter arrived on HOA letterhead, citing Section 4.2 of the covenant, demanding I remove my tomato and pepper plants within 14 days or face a daily fine of $50. I read it twice, certain it had to be a mistake. It was not. I called the HOA office, polite and measured, the way I'd been trained to defuse far more dangerous situations than an argument about tomatoes. The woman on the phone sighed and said, "Deborah handles all exceptions personally. Good luck with that." Then I wanted to admit, reminding myself that federal agents learn patience for exactly this kind of small, grinding bureaucratic absurdity. That phrase, "Good luck with that," said with a flat little laugh, told me everything about how residents actually felt about their HOA president. Nobody said it to her face. Everybody said it behind her back. The way people talk about whether they can't control. I decided the smartest move was simply to comply. Fighting a homeowners association over lettuce was not worth blowing 11 months of careful cover for a federal case. I began digging up the garden bed myself on a quiet Saturday morning, trying not to think about it. Deborah drove by twice while I worked, slowing her SUV just enough to watch, never once rolling down the window. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things that spring that turned out, eventually, to be wrong. The garden should have ended it. Instead, it seemed to feed something in Deborah, like compliance was an invitation rather than a resolution. 2 weeks later, a new letter arrived, this one accusing me of an unauthorized modification to my driveway that I had never made. I photographed my driveway, unchanged since I'd moved in, and brought the pictures to the next HOA meeting, expecting a quick, reasonable correction. Instead, Deborah stood at the podium and suggested, calmly, that perhaps I had photoshopped the images. A few board members actually nodded. A few residents near the back exchanged uneasy glances, clearly recognizing the accusation as absurd, though none of them said so out loud in the room. That was the first time I felt something shift in my chest. A small, cold recognition that this was not really about a driveway. Deborah needed a target, and for reasons I did not yet understand, she had decided that target was me. After the meeting, an older man named Ray Alvarez caught up with me in the parking lot. He'd lived in Willow Creek longer than anyone, retired, sharp-eyed, always tending his roses. "Don't fight her alone," he said quietly. "She doesn't lose." I thanked him and didn't think much of the warning at the time. I had bigger things occupying my mind. Meridian Holdings had just opened a new account that matched a pattern my team had been chasing for months. Deborah Kowalski felt, frankly, like a distraction. Still, the fines kept coming. A crack in my sidewalk I hadn't reported. A trash can left out 4 hours past pickup, photographed and time-stamped. Each violation notice was polite in language and merciless in consequence, stacking penalties that had begun to genuinely add up. I paid the first few out of pocket rather than draw attention to myself. An FBI agent disputing HOA fines in a public meeting was not the kind of visibility my case needed. Deborah, I suspect, mistook my silence for weakness, which was, in hindsight, her first real mistake. Pam Ellis started avoiding eye contact with me around this time, waving quickly and retreating indoors whenever I stepped onto my porch. I noticed but didn't push. Everyone in Willow Creek seemed to be managing their own quiet trade with Deborah's approval, and questions were not welcome. At a community barbecue I attended mostly for cover, I overheard Deborah telling another board member that some people just don't understand how a neighborhood is supposed to work. She was looking directly at me when she said it, smiling the entire time. I smiled back. Teach you that the most dangerous reaction to provocation is often none at all. Deborah wanted a fight. Unreadable calm, which, I would later learn, unsettled her more than any argument could have. The fines crossed $400 by early summer. I finally requested a formal hearing, the kind the HOA bylaws technically guaranteed every resident. Deborah approved the request herself, scheduling it for a Tuesday night she almost certainly knew I'd struggle to attend. I attended anyway, rearranging a surveillance shift with Agent Diaz, my partner on the Meridian case, who covered for me without asking too many questions. He'd learned, over 2 years working together, that some things I simply couldn't explain, and he'd stopped asking why. Agent Diaz texted twice that evening just to check whether I needed backup of any kind, a small kindness I appreciated more than I let on. The hearing lasted 11 minutes. Deborah presented photographs, most unrelated to my actual property, and the board voted 3-1 to uphold every fine. The lone dissenting vote came from a quiet man named Harold, who wouldn't meet my eyes afterward. Walking to my car, Ray Alvarez fell into step beside me. "She's done this before," he said, voice low. "To the Whitfields, 2 years back. They moved out within 6 months. Couldn't take it anymore." I asked what happened to them. He just shook his head. I started, almost against my training, keeping a private folder on Deborah Kowalski, separate from my actual case files. Dates, letters, photographs of her own house, which I noticed conveniently never seemed to be photographed for violations by anyone else on the board. Frank Kowalski's business, meanwhile, kept appearing at the edges of my real investigation. Payment here, a shared address there, nothing conclusive, but enough that my instincts, sharpened by years of chasing money through shell companies, began to hum with quiet suspicion. I mentioned it to Agent Kessler in one of our late-night calls, careful to frame it as a possible lead rather than a personal grievance. Interesting, he said. Keep your head down. Become a liability. I promised I would try. Trying and succeeding were two different things. The following week, Deborah posted a notice on the community app naming my address specifically for repeated noncompliance, a level of public shaming the bylaws technically didn't even allow for a first-time dispute like mine. Neighbors I'd never spoken to began giving me sideways glances at the mailbox. One woman actually crossed the street rather than pass my house. Reputation, I realized, was Deborah's real weapon, more effective than any fine, and she wielded it with practiced precision. I could have escalated things legally right then. I had the resources, the knowledge, the case law memorized from years of dealing with people who thought rules only applied to others. Instead, I chose patience, the same patience I'd used to bring down men far more dangerous than Deborah Kowalski. What I didn't yet know was that patience would soon be tested in ways that had nothing to do with tomatoes, mailboxes, or driveway cracks, and everything to do with just how far a woman convinced of her own righteousness was willing to go. The escalation started small, the way these things always do. A routine inspection request from the HOA appeared on my door, demanding entry to check for unauthorized structural changes. I hadn't touched a single wall. I declined politely and requested it in writing. I read the notice twice at my kitchen table, radar watching from the windowsill, before deciding the smartest response was simply to document everything and wait. Deborah's response came fast. A certified letter threatening a lien on my property if I refused inspection within 72 hours. Liens, I knew from my training, were not something HOA presidents handed out casually. This felt less like enforcement and more like a warning shot. I called a property attorney friend from my academy days, careful to frame it as a friend's HOA issue. She confirmed what I suspected. Deborah was pushing well past the limits of her actual authority, betting that most residents wouldn't know, or wouldn't fight, the difference. At the next board meeting, I brought the attorney's summary and read it aloud, calmly citing the exact bylaw sections Deborah had misapplied. For the first time, I watched her composure slip, just slightly, a flicker of something sharper than annoyance crossing her face. "You think you're smarter than the rest of us," she said afterward, cornering me in the parking lot, voice low enough that only I could hear it. "People like you always think the rules don't apply to you." I simply asked which rules she meant. She didn't answer, and drove off, tires chirping slightly on the wet pavement, a small, telling loss of control from a woman who prided herself on never losing control of anything. I made a note of it. Turned, always widen. I watched her taillights disappear around the corner and felt, for the first time, that I finally understood what actually frightened Deborah Kowalski. 2 days later, my trash cans were found tipped over on the curb, contents scattered across my lawn, time-stamped and photographed as a new violation before I'd even had a chance to clean it up. The photograph, oddly, showed no wind, no rain, no obvious cause. I checked the doorbell camera I'd installed months earlier for entirely different reasons. The footage showed a figure in a dark hoodie tipping the cans over at 5:42 a.m., moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed no one was watching. I zoomed in twice. The build matched Frank Kowalski. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I saved the footage in triplicate, backed up across 2 separate drives, and added it quietly to the growing file I told myself, less and less convincingly, was purely for personal record-keeping. Pam Ellis finally spoke to me honestly for the first time in weeks, catching me at the mailbox with a nervous, hurried whisper. "Be careful," she said. "Deborah doesn't just find people. She finds ways to make their lives difficult until they leave on their own." I asked her directly if Deborah had ever done something like that to her. Pam's face went pale, and she quickly changed the subject to the weather, walking away faster than the conversation warranted. I let her go, but the fear in her eyes stayed with me. The fines against me now totaled over $1,100, each one meticulously documented, each one nearly impossible to appeal given how the board, handpicked by Deborah, consistently voted in her favor. It was, I realized, a system built to look fair while functioning as anything but. I began quietly cross-referencing HOA financial disclosures, a public record any homeowner had the right to request. Deborah stalled the request for 3 weeks, citing administrative delays, before finally producing documents that were, conveniently, missing several key pages from the reserve fund ledger. My instincts, honed over a decade of following paper trails through far more sophisticated criminal enterprises, started tingling in a very specific, familiar way. Missing pages rarely meant simple disorganization. More often, they meant someone had something worth hiding, and hoped nobody would look closely enough to notice. I didn't have jurisdiction to formally investigate an HOA's finances, and doing so risked exposing exactly who I really was. So I did what any careful investigator does when the itch won't quit. I kept watching, kept documenting, and waited for a mistake big enough to matter. That mistake, I would later discover, involved Pam Ellis more directly than I ever expected. A slipped comment from Harold, the one board member who'd voted against my fines, revealed that Pam received a hardship discount on her dues in exchange for reporting neighborhood gossip to Deborah personally. It explained the nervous glances, the sudden silences, the way Pam always seemed torn between friendliness and fear. She wasn't my enemy. She was simply another resident caught in a system where survival meant quietly feeding information to the person who controlled everyone's peace of mind. I didn't blame her. Not really. I understood better than most people how fear reshapes behavior, how ordinary people make small compromises that stack up until they no longer recognize the shape of their own choices. Still, it meant I needed to be more careful about what I said near her. The fines escalated to a formal notice of intent to place a lien, this time with real legal teeth behind it, citing my pattern of noncompliance. I finally paid an attorney, using a different name for the retainer, to formally respond and demand the underlying financial records Deborah kept dodging. Deborah showed up unannounced at my door 2 days after the letter was sent. No clipboard this time, just a tight, controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We should talk. Neighbor to neighbor," she said, "before this gets more complicated than it needs to be." I let her in, curious what version of herself she'd present without an audience. She sat stiffly on my couch, glancing around my living room like she was cataloging it for future violations, and told me, almost gently, that fighting the board never ends well for anyone. She left a faint trace of her perfume behind on my couch cushions. A small, strange detail I noticed only after she'd already driven away. "Is that a threat?" I asked, keeping my voice level, the same tone I'd used on suspects who thought calm meant weakness. Deborah's smile flickered. "It's advice," she said. "The Whitfields didn't listen either. Look how that turned out for them." She left without saying more. I finally looked up the Whitfields properly that night, using resources most residents wouldn't have access to. Public records showed a rushed home sale 18 months prior, well below market value, filed within weeks of a lien notice remarkably similar to the one now threatening me. Something about the pattern felt less like coincidence and more like design. I widened my search and found 2 more former Willow Creek residents who'd sold quickly, quietly, and at a loss, all within the past 4 years, all after disputes with the HOA board Deborah controlled. I brought this pattern, carefully anonymized, to Agent Kessler during our next call, framing it as a potential predicate for a separate inquiry. He was skeptical but curious. "Property flipping through forced sales isn't unheard of," he said. "But it's not our case. Stay focused, Reyes." He was right, professionally. My mandate was Meridian Holdings, not a homeowners association bullying its neighbors. But professional focus and personal instinct don't always agree. And mine kept whispering that Deborah Kowalski's empire of clipboards and fines was built on something far uglier than mere pettiness. Still, the seed of doubt he'd planted lingered, quietly reshaping how carefully I began watching everything happening around Willow Creek Estates from that point forward. The lien notice against my house became official that Friday, filed with the county, a formal cloud now sitting over a property I'd chosen specifically because it was supposed to be quiet, unremarkable, invisible. Deborah had made it, instead, the center of unwanted attention. I paid off the lien in full within 48 hours, using savings I'd kept for emergencies, just to remove the paper trail before it could compromise my cover. Deborah, I suspect, expected me to fight publicly. My silence, again, seemed to frustrate her more than resistance ever could have. "You just gave up?" Ray Alvarez asked me over the fence a few days later, sounding almost disappointed. I told him I was choosing my battles. He studied me for a long moment, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected, and said, "You're not like the others, are you?" I laughed it off, but the question sat with me longer than I wanted to admit. Ray had a way of watching the neighborhood that felt less like idle retirement and more like habit, the kind you develop when observation has once been part of your job, not just your hobby. I filed that thought away too, alongside the growing folder on Deborah, the footage of Frank tipping my trash cans, and the strange pattern of forced sales. Somewhere underneath the quiet cul-de-sacs of Willow Creek Estates, something larger than petty HOA politics was beginning to take shape. For nearly 3 weeks after the lien was paid, things went quiet. No new violation notices appeared in my mailbox. Deborah waved from her SUV instead of stopping to measure things. I told myself, cautiously, that maybe the worst of it had finally passed. I focused back on Meridian Holdings, where the investigation had picked up real momentum. A confidential source inside a regional bank had flagged a series of transfers that matched our laundering theory almost exactly. funneling cash through small property management companies just like Frank Kowalski's. Agent Diaz and I spent long nights reviewing transaction logs, building a timeline that increasingly suggested Willow Creek itself, or at least businesses connected to it, played some role in moving money for people who very much did not want to be found. I allowed myself, during this lull, small moments of normal life. Coffee on the porch. A movie with radar curled on my lap. A short, easy conversation with Pam over the fence about nothing more dangerous than the unpredictable spring weather rolling through Ohio that year. Ray Alvarez started leaving fresh tomatoes on my doorstep some mornings. Quiet, wordless gesture that felt like an apology for a fight I hadn't even started yet. I never asked why. Grateful for a kindness that asked nothing in return. The HOA newsletter that month was almost gentle by Deborah's standards, focused mostly on pool maintenance schedules and an upcoming community yard sale. I read it twice, half expecting a hidden barb aimed at me, and found none. The calm felt strange, unfamiliar, almost suspicious in its own right. I mentioned the shift to Agent Kessler, more out of habit than necessity. Sometimes people back down, he said. Sometimes they regroup. I didn't tell him which possibility felt more likely to me. Years in this job had taught me that silence from a cornered animal rarely meant surrender. Harold, the dissenting board member, resigned unexpectedly during this quiet stretch, citing personal reasons in a brief note posted to the community app. Nobody seemed to think much of it. I did. The only real check on Deborah's authority. And now that check was gone. I asked around gently, careful not to draw attention, and learned Deborah had personally recommended his replacement. A soft-spoken woman named Trish who'd moved in only 8 months earlier and, according to Pam, did whatever Deborah suggested without asking too many questions. The board, I realized, was no longer even nominally independent. Every remaining member owed their position, in some form, to Deborah's approval. The quiet weeks, I began to suspect, weren't peace at all. They were construction. Deborah methodically clearing away anything capable of standing in her way. I wondered, watching Trish's careful, deliberate nods during the meeting, how many other residents were quietly performing the same uneasy compliance every single month. I doubled my own quiet preparations, backing up the trash can footage to an encrypted drive, printing hard copies of the lien filing and fine notices, and keeping a written timeline updated nightly. The same discipline I applied to every real federal case I'd ever worked. Ray Alvarez, over one of our porch conversations, mentioned almost casually that Deborah had once worked in some kind of collections job before marrying Frank and taking over the HOA full-time. It was a small detail. I filed it away with everything else, waiting for a pattern to emerge. The calm ended on a Thursday evening in late spring, when Deborah called an emergency board meeting with less than 24 hours notice, citing serious violations requiring immediate community attention. I felt, reading the notice, the particular cold certainty that the quiet had simply been the calm before something worse. I attended the emergency meeting expecting a routine agenda item blown out of proportion, which had become something of a Willow Creek tradition. Instead, Deborah opened by announcing, with visible relish, a comprehensive audit of every homeowner's compliance history, myself included, front and center on a projector slide. My photograph, taken without my knowledge from what looked like a doorbell camera angle, sat beside a list of every fine I'd ever incurred, formatted like evidence in a courtroom. Deborah described me, without using my name, as a resident who continues to test the limits of our patience. I kept my expression neutral throughout the presentation, though inwardly I was already cataloging exactly how each slide would eventually read as evidence. I said nothing during the meeting, watching neighbors nod along, some clearly uncomfortable, none willing to speak up against her. Afterward, in the parking lot, Trish, the new board member, approached me quietly. "For what it's worth," she whispered, "not everyone agrees with how she runs things." I thanked her, filing away one more small crack in Deborah's carefully maintained wall of consensus. It wasn't much, but I'd learned in this job that empires rarely fall from a single blow. They fall from 1,000 small fractures nobody notices until the whole structure gives way at once. The following week, Deborah escalated further, proposing a new bylaw amendment requiring homeowners to submit landscaping plans for board approval before any changes, retroactive to include existing gardens. It read, transparently, like a rule written specifically to give her permanent control over my replanted tomato bed. The amendment passed easily, 4 votes to 1. Trish the lone holdout. I watched Deborah's satisfied expression as the vote was tallied and understood, with total clarity, that this had never really been about landscaping, mailboxes, or driveways. It was about control, and about me refusing to bend to it. I began, cautiously, exploring my legal options more seriously, consulting with the attorney friend again under a different pretense. She confirmed the amendment likely violated state HOA regulations regarding retroactive enforcement, but warned that fighting it formally would take months and considerable public exposure I couldn't afford. Frank Kowalski's business activity, meanwhile, spiked sharply that same week. 3 new accounts opening within Meridian's known network, each traced back to addresses uncomfortably close to Willow Creek Estates. Agent Diaz flagged it as significant. I flagged it, privately, as far too coincidental to ignore any longer. I requested, carefully and through proper channels, an expanded scope on the Meridian investigation, citing the new account activity. Agent Kessler approved it cautiously, reminding me twice to keep personal matters entirely separate from professional judgment. I promised him I would. I wasn't entirely sure it was still true. The lines between my 2 lives, cover and case, had begun blurring in ways my training explicitly warned against. Deborah Kowalski was no longer simply an obstacle to my quiet cover. She had become, whether I liked it or not, potentially connected to the very case I'd been sent here to build. I started watching the Kowalski house more deliberately during my usual evening walks, noting Frank's schedule, the unfamiliar cars that occasionally idled in their driveway after dark, the small, careful patterns of a household that, like mine, was hiding something behind an ordinary front. It was during one of these walks that I finally understood the missing pages from the HOA financial disclosure. A resident, frustrated after his own fine dispute, mentioned offhand that the reserve fund, meant for community repairs, had shrunk nearly 40% over the past 3 years with no clear explanation. 40% of a reserve fund built from mandatory dues, unaccounted for, missing exactly the pages that would explain where it went. I didn't need a badge to recognize the shape of embezzlement when I saw it laid out that plainly. Deborah wasn't just controlling. She was stealing. I couldn't prove it yet. Not formally. And I had no legal standing to investigate an HOA's internal finances as part of a federal money laundering case. But the instinct that had served me through a decade of undercover work told me these two threads, Deborah's fund and Frank's business, were connected. I brought the theory to Agent Kessler, more directly this time, laying out the pattern of forced sales, the missing ledger pages, and Frank's spiking account activity. He was quiet for a long moment. "If you're right," he finally said, "this is bigger than either of us expected. Keep documenting." I threw myself into the work with renewed focus, careful to keep my two investigations, personal and professional, in separate, clearly labeled folders, even as the line between them grew thinner by the day. Deborah, unaware of any of this, continued her campaign against my tomato garden without pause. A formal violation notice arrived demanding I remove the garden within 7 days under the new retroactive amendment. Fines to begin accruing immediately at $75 daily, nearly double the original rate. I read it standing in my kitchen, radar winding around my ankles, and felt something in me settle. I stood there a long moment after reading it, coffee going cold, weighing exactly how much of myself I was willing to risk over a garden bed. I would not be fighting Deborah Kowalski over a garden anymore. I would be watching her, patiently and precisely, the same way I'd watched dozens of men far more dangerous than her across a decade of federal work, waiting for the moment her carefully built control finally cracked open. Pam Ellis knocked on my door that evening, visibly shaken, admitting quietly that Deborah had pressured her into reporting my suspicious late-night activity. The calls to my burner phone, the odd hours, the occasional black van parked nearby that Pam had noticed but never understood. My stomach tightened. But not careful enough, apparently, for a neighbor's attentive eyes. I asked Pam, gently, what exactly she'd told Deborah. "Not much," she said. "Just that you seemed different. That something felt off. She scares me more than I want to admit." I reassured Pam as best I could without revealing anything, and after she left, sat with the uncomfortable knowledge that my cover, carefully constructed over 11 months, now had a visible crack in it. One created not by Deborah's petty fines but by her genuine, obsessive surveillance of every resident. I called Agent Kessler that night and flagged the risk honestly. He considered pulling me from the property entirely, a real possibility that would have meant abandoning 11 months of positioning right as the Meridian case finally seemed to be accelerating. We agreed, cautiously, to increase counter-surveillance instead. We agreed the risk was manageable for now, though both of us understood that manageable and comfortable were never quite the same thing in this line of work. A second team, working discreetly, began monitoring not just Frank Kowalski's business movements but Deborah's as well, treating her now as a potential person of interest rather than simply a neighborhood nuisance complicating my cover. The distraction had become, whether by coincidence or design, part of the case itself. Deborah, blissfully unaware that federal attention had quietly expanded to include her, escalated her public campaign against me at the next board meeting, proposing I be issued a formal community standards violation letter, the HOA's most severe pre-legal warning, over the still unremoved tomato garden. The letter passed unanimously, Trish included this time, visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to risk another confrontation after watching how thoroughly Harold had been pushed out for far less. I understood her silence completely. Fear, I'd learned by now, was Deborah's most reliable and renewable resource. I removed the tomato garden the following weekend, not out of surrender, but out of strategy, refusing to give Deborah any legitimate procedural foothold while the larger investigation quietly built around her. Every plant I dug up felt like a small, deliberate sacrifice toward a much bigger goal. Ray Alvarez watched me work from his own yard, saying nothing for a long while before finally speaking. "She'll find something else," he said. "She always does. Come after you again." "It's when." I told him I was counting on it. Something in my tone must have surprised him, because he studied me with new interest, the same careful, assessing look he'd given me weeks earlier. "You really aren't like the others," he said again. Quieter this time, almost like he was confirming a private theory to himself. I let the comment pass without response, though it stayed with me through the rest of that afternoon. Ray Alvarez, I was beginning to suspect, understood far more about Willow Creek Estates, and perhaps about me, than his quiet retiree routine of roses and small talk ever let on. The Meridian investigation reached a critical point that same week, when Agent Diaz uncovered a direct wire transfer from a Kowalski Property Advisors account to a shell company already tied to 2 other confirmed laundering fronts in the region. It was the clearest link we'd found yet. I felt the strange, dual pull of the moment sharply. Professional triumph at the case finally breaking open, tangled with a personal wariness about what it would mean when Frank Kowalski's business, and by extension his household, became the formal center of a federal investigation. Agent Kessler scheduled a strategy meeting, cautioning the team that any move against Kowalski Property Advisors needed to remain airtight and untraceable back to sources still embedded in the community. My cover, fragile as it now felt, remained essential to building the case without alerting Frank prematurely. Deborah, entirely unaware of the storm quietly gathering around her own household, seemed almost energized by my compliance with the garden removal, treating it as proof that her methods worked. She began targeting other residents with renewed enthusiasm, emboldened by what she saw as another decisive victory. I watched this pattern with a strange, clinical detachment now, recognizing in Deborah's escalating confidence the same overreach I'd seen in countless suspects who mistook a lack of visible resistance for genuine defeat. People like that, in my experience, rarely knew how to stop until something finally forced them to. A new resident, an elderly widower named Mr. Chin, became Deborah's next target, fined repeatedly over minor issues with his mailbox flag angle. Of all things, I watched him grow visibly stressed at community events, and recognized in his exhaustion an earlier version of my own frustration. I began quietly documenting Deborah's treatment of other residents too, not just my own case, building a broader pattern that felt increasingly relevant beyond my personal grievances. If the reserve fund truly was being misused, evidence of systemic bullying might eventually support a much larger reckoning. Trish, the reluctant board member, reached out to me privately one afternoon, admitting she'd started keeping her own records of votes she felt pressured into approving. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. "I just know something isn't right." I told her to keep everything safe. Trish's hands were shaking slightly as she spoke, and I recognized in that small tremor the particular courage it takes to finally say something out loud. I couldn't reveal who I really was Not yet, not without risking the entire Meridian case. But I encouraged Trish gently to trust her instincts and continue documenting. Small allies, gathered carefully and quietly, had a way of becoming decisive later, in ways that weren't always predictable in the moment. The summer heat settled hard over Willow Creek that July, and with it came a strange, uneasy stillness in the neighborhood, the kind that precedes storms both literal and otherwise. Deborah's fines against Mr. Chun continued. Mercifully, remained quiet for nearly 2 full weeks. I used the lull to push harder on Meridian, spending long nights cross-referencing wire transfers, building timelines that increasingly painted a clear picture. Frank Kowalski's business was a critical node in a laundering network moving significant sums through a chain of shell companies and small local fronts. Agent Kessler informed me the case had reached a threshold requiring formal briefing to federal prosecutors. A milestone that meant, realistically, weeks rather than months before some form of action would need to be taken against Kowalski Property Advisors and the broader Meridian network it served. I felt the walls of my careful double life narrowing. The timeline of my cover in Willow Creek suddenly finite in a way it hadn't felt before. Whatever happened next with Deborah, with Frank, with the entire fragile ecosystem of this neighborhood, would need to happen soon. I allowed myself, briefly, to imagine what an ordinary version of this year might have looked like, before pushing the thought firmly aside and returning to work. Deborah, sensing perhaps that her earlier momentum had stalled, called another emergency meeting, this time proposing the creation of a private community enforcement service, hired directly by the HOA, to handle repeat violations more aggressively than warning letters and fines apparently allowed for. The proposal described uniformed personnel with authority to issue on-site citations and, in cases of active noncompliance, physically ensure violations were corrected immediately. Reading the wording twice, I felt a cold recognition that Deborah was building herself something dangerously close to a private police force. The board approved it 3-1. Trish again the lone dissent, her objection noted but overruled without discussion. Deborah announced she'd already identified a company, called Sentinel Shield, willing to provide compliance officers starting the following month. Funded, notably, through an unspecified line item in the HOA budget. I requested the HOA's updated financial breakdown under the pretense of general homeowner curiosity, and found the entire Sentinel Shield contract paid for through what remained of the mysteriously shrinking reserve fund, the same fund already missing nearly half its expected balance from prior years. Deborah was quite literally funding her own private enforcement squad with money that, by every indication I'd gathered, she had been quietly siphoning from the very residents she now planned to intimidate. The audacity of it, once I saw the full shape, was almost impressive in its shamelessness. Sentinel Shield's first uniformed officers appeared in Willow Creek within 2 weeks, driving unmarked black SUVs with subtle gold shields stitched onto navy polos, deliberately styled to resemble law enforcement without technically claiming to be police. Residents, predictably, treated them exactly like officers anyway. I researched the company quietly, using resources careful enough not to trigger any flags on my personal search history. Sentinel Shield held no state security licensing, no bonded certification, nothing beyond a basic LLC registration filed 8 months earlier by an address matching a P.O. box. Not an office. It was, as far as I could determine, essentially two guys and a logo, hired cash in hand to intimidate homeowners into compliance under a thin veneer of official authority. Deborah had built herself exactly what she wanted: uniforms without accountability, power without oversight, funded by the very fund she'd been draining. Mr. First target, confronted in his own driveway over the still unresolved mailbox flag violation, the encounter escalating loudly enough that two neighbors called actual police, only for the responding officers to clarify, awkwardly, that Sentinel Shield had no legal authority whatsoever on private property. Deborah spun the incident at the next meeting as a minor miscommunication, praising Sentinel Shield's commitment to community standards while quietly ensuring Mr. Chen's fines doubled anyway for the disturbance his confrontation had allegedly caused. Nobody on the board challenged the obvious injustice of it. I recognized, with growing unease, that Deborah's willingness to fund and deploy essentially unregulated enforcement personnel represented a serious escalation, one that increasingly resembled patterns of intimidation I'd seen used by figures connected to organized financial crime, not typically by suburban homeowners association presidents. The connection crystallized further when I traced Sentinel Shield's cash payments back to an account that, remarkably, shared a signatory with one of Frank Kowalski's known Meridian-linked shell companies. Deborah's private enforcement squad, turned out, wasn't just funded by stolen HOA dues. It was tangled directly into my federal case. I brought this discovery to Agent Kessler immediately, and for the first time since the investigation began, I watched genuine surprise cross his usually composed expression during our call. "You're telling me your neighborhood dispute just merged with a federal money laundering case," he said. "That's Reyes." The team moved quickly to formally add Deborah Kowalski as a person of interest. Her role still unclear, but her financial fingerprints now undeniably present. Across both the HOA embezzlement and the broader Meridian network, Frank had been quietly serving for years without her official involvement documented anywhere. I felt a strange, unsettling clarity settle over me. Deborah wasn't simply a controlling HOA president anymore. She was, potentially, an active participant in laundering stolen community funds through her husband's business, using a private enforcement squad to keep dissenting residents too intimidated to look closely enough to notice. It was a strange kind of clarity, equal parts vindication and unease, realizing the pettiest woman I'd ever met might also be a genuine federal target. Sentinel Shield's presence in the neighborhood grew more aggressive over the following weeks. Uniformed men now conducting unannounced compliance walks through residents' backyards, citing violations that hadn't existed the previous year, each fine funneling more money into an account increasingly tied to federal criminal activity. Pam Ellis, visibly frightened now rather than merely nervous, told me one evening that Sentinel Shield had photographed inside her garage without permission, documenting items completely unrelated to any HOA violation. "They're not just enforcing rules anymore," she whispered. "They're building files." I recognized the phrase instantly, the same instinct that had once made me start my own private folder on Deborah, now apparently mirrored, in far more invasive form, by Deborah herself against the entire neighborhood. Control, I understood now, was never really her goal. Information was, and control simply followed from it. Trish resigned from the board that week, citing the Sentinel Shield expansion as beyond what I'm comfortable enabling, a rare public crack in Deborah's carefully maintained image of unanimous community support. Deborah replaced her within 48 hours with someone even more compliant than before. I attended the next meeting specifically to observe Deborah's demeanor now that real dissent had finally, publicly, emerged. She showed no hesitation, no doubt, simply announcing Trish's resignation as a personal decision unrelated to board matters, and moving directly into a new round of proposed enforcement measures. The silence in the room afterward said more than any single vote could have. Quiet, collective discomfort nobody present was willing to voice aloud. The measures included expanded Sentinel Shield authority to physically remediate violations deemed urgent. Language vague enough to cover almost anything Deborah decided qualified. I understood, watching the vote pass 3-0 this time, that the last meaningful check on her power had just been formally removed. Ray Alvarez found me afterward, his expression graver than I'd seen it before. "This isn't about HOA rules anymore," he said quietly. "I've seen people like her before. A long time ago. In a different life. She's not going to stop until someone with real authority makes her." Something in the specific phrasing, "a different life," caught my attention sharply. I asked him, carefully, what he meant. He studied me for a long moment before simply saying, "Everyone in this neighborhood has a past, Maya. Some of us just choose which parts of it to bring up over the fence." I let the comment sit unanswered, filing it away with the growing collection of details about Ray that no longer felt like simple neighborly color. Whoever he had been before Willow Creek Estates, it clearly involved more than roses and quiet retirement, though I still lacked the pieces to know exactly what. The Meridian case, meanwhile, accelerated toward a formal takedown phase. Prosecutors now reviewing evidence for what looked increasingly like a significant, multi-defendant indictment involving Frank Kowalski, the Shell Network, and, pending further documentation, potentially Deborah herself through the Sentinel Shield financial trail we'd uncovered. Agent Kessler warned me the operations timeline had compressed sharply, likely moving within the next 3 to 4 weeks rather than the months I'd originally anticipated. My cover, already strained by Pam's earlier suspicions and Deborah's obsessive surveillance habits, needed to hold just a little longer. Deborah, unaware of any of this, turned her renewed enforcement energy directly back toward me, apparently deciding my quiet compliance over the tomato garden had been merely a temporary retreat rather than genuine surrender. A new violation notice arrived, citing an improperly stored recreational vehicle, a bicycle propped against my garage. I paid the fine without comment, recognizing now that every interaction with Deborah carried risk far beyond mere neighborhood annoyance. Somewhere behind her clipboard and linen blazers sat a woman potentially entangled in real federal crimes, and provoking her unnecessarily could jeopardize far more than my landscaping preferences. Sentinel Shield's uniformed men began appearing near my house specifically, parking their unmarked SUV across the street for extended periods, ostensibly monitoring recurring violations, but clearly, given the timing, watching me directly following Pam's earlier reports about my unusual late-night phone habits. I adjusted my behavior carefully, moving my burner phone calls entirely indoors, drawing blinds I'd previously left open, treating my own home now with the same operational caution I usually reserved for active surveillance sites rather than a place I was supposed to simply, quietly, live radar. Sensing my heightened tension despite his complete indifference to federal investigations, took to sitting by the front window each evening, watching the same street I watched. An odd, small companionship in what had become an increasingly isolating and carefully guarded existence. Frank Kowalski's account activity spiked dramatically that week. 3 large transfers moving through Kowalski Property Advisors within 72 hours, each one matching known Meridian laundering patterns almost exactly. Agent Diaz flagged it as likely evidence of the network attempting to move funds ahead of anticipated exposure. I understood immediately what that meant. Someone, somewhere in the broader Meridian network, suspected the investigation was closing in and was scrambling to hide assets before formal charges could freeze them. The timeline Kessler had warned me about compressed further, suddenly measured in days rather than weeks. Deborah, seemingly sensing nothing of her husband's frantic financial maneuvering, escalated her own campaign against me instead, announcing at an impromptu doorstep visit that Sentinel Shield would begin direct compliance verification for any resident with more than 3 unresolved violations, myself now squarely included on that list. What does direct compliance verification mean? I asked her, keeping my voice carefully neutral despite the very specific alarm the vague, ominous phrasing triggered in me. Deborah smiled thinly. It means we stop asking nicely, she said. You've had plenty of chances. Ms. Reyes. Out eventually. Her voice carried none of the polished civility she usually performed at board meetings, and for a moment I saw something colder underneath it entirely. I closed the door calmly, waited until her SUV pulled away, and immediately called Agent Kessler, explaining the escalating threat and the increasingly tight timeline colliding dangerously with my cover. He agreed the situation had grown untenable and authorized quiet additional protective surveillance around my property starting immediately. A discreet unmarked van, driven by agents I trusted completely, began parking a block away during evening hours, monitoring both my safety and, conveniently, gathering additional footage of Frank Kowalski's increasingly erratic movements between his office, his house, and locations tied to the broader Meridian network. I felt, for the first time in months, something like relief, knowing that whatever Deborah's direct compliance verification ultimately meant, it would not happen without witnesses far more capable than nervous neighbors peering through blinds. Still, the waiting, not knowing exactly when or how it would come, gnawed at me. Ray Alvarez appeared at my door 2 evenings later, uninvited but clearly deliberate, holding a small paper bag of fresh vegetables as cover for a visit that quickly became something else entirely. I need you to listen carefully, he said, voice dropping into something far more serious than I'd heard from him before. Deborah's done this exact thing before, he said. Not just the Whitfields. There's a pattern going back years. And it always ends the same way. Someone getting hurt badly enough that people finally start asking questions. I think you might be next. I think you should be very careful. I thanked him for the warning, though something in his tone told me he was holding back at least as much as he was sharing. I asked him, directly this time, how he knew so much detail about a pattern most residents seemed completely unaware of. Ray was quiet for a long moment, weighing something behind his careful eyes, before finally saying only, let's just say I've spent a long career learning to notice patterns like this one. I didn't push further, recognizing in his deflection the same careful evasiveness I used myself daily. Whatever Ray Alvarez actually was, retired cop, former investigator, something else entirely. He clearly saw more in Willow Creek Estates than casual roses and small-talk retirement typically allowed for, and that recognition unsettled me deeply. The following morning, Agent Kessler called with news that shifted everything. Prosecutors had approved formal charges against the Core Meridian network, with coordinated arrests planned within the week. Frank Kowalski named specifically among the primary targets given the volume of laundering evidence tied directly to his business. "We need you to maintain cover exactly as normal until execution day," Kessler instructed. "Any visible change in behavior risks tipping off Kowalski or anyone connected to him before we're ready to move. Can you hold steady, Reyes?" Even with everything happening on the HOA side, I told him yes. It was, admittedly, not entirely true. Deborah's direct compliance verification loomed over every hour now. An unknown threat with an unknown timeline, colliding directly against a federal operation that required exactly the kind of calm, unremarkable normalcy I was finding increasingly difficult to maintain under mounting pressure. I spent that evening quietly reviewing everything I'd gathered. The trashcan footage, the lean documents, the missing ledger pages, the Sentinel Shield financial trail, organizing it all methodically in case any of it became necessary evidence once my real identity, inevitably, could no longer stay hidden. Pam Ellis knocked on my door late that night, visibly shaken, whispering that she'd overheard Deborah on the phone with someone from Sentinel Shield, discussing an example that needs to be made before the next board meeting. Specific enough in tone that Pam felt compelled, finally, to warn me directly. "I think she means you," Pam said. "I heard my own address mentioned too, but mostly yours. I'm sorry I ever told her anything about your phone calls. I didn't know it would go this far." I thanked her for the warning and told her, honestly, that none of this was her fault. After Pam left, I called Kessler again, relaying the overheard threat. He confirmed the arrest operation remained scheduled, but agreed the situation now carried genuine physical risk requiring closer monitoring. "We'll have eyes on your property continuously starting tomorrow," he said. "Whatever happens, you won't be alone out there." I slept poorly that night. Radar curled against my side. The quiet street outside my window feeling, for the first time since I'd moved in, genuinely dangerous rather than simply inconvenient. Somewhere across the neighborhood, Deborah Kowalski was planning something, and I no longer had any real idea what. The next morning brought a new HOA notice, hand-delivered rather than mailed, informing me that Sentinel Shield would conduct a final compliance inspection of my property within 72 hours. Language deliberately vague about what exactly that inspection would involve or what consequences non-compliance might carry this time. I photographed the notice immediately, adding it to my growing evidence file, and forwarded a copy directly to Kessler, who confirmed the surveillance team would specifically prioritize coverage during that 72-hour window, treating it now as the most likely flashpoint for whatever Deborah was ultimately planning. Ray Alvarez showed up again that afternoon, this time without the pretense of vegetables, simply standing at my door with an expression I'd come to recognize as genuine concern beneath his usual careful reserve. "Whatever's coming," he said, "I want you to know you're not as alone in this as you think." I studied him carefully, weighing whether to finally ask directly what he meant by that repeated, deliberate phrasing. Before I could, he added, quieter still, "Some of us have been watching this neighborhood a lot longer than Deborah Kowalski realizes. You're not the only one who notices patterns. Maya." The comment landed heavier than he probably intended, confirming a suspicion I'd been circling for weeks without quite letting myself fully believe it. Whoever Ray Alvarez truly was, His presence in Willow Creek felt increasingly less like coincidence and more like something deliberately, carefully positioned, much like my own. The porch light behind him flickered once, and for a strange moment the whole street felt smaller, quieter, like it was holding its breath with us. I didn't press further that day, recognizing that whatever Ray was preparing to reveal, the timing needed to be his choice, not mine, especially with the Meridian operation now bearing down fast enough that every unnecessary complication risked destabilizing something far larger than either of us individually. The 72-hour window tightened around me with each passing hour. Sentinel Shield's SUV now parked almost permanently across the street. Uniformed men occasionally walking my property line with clipboards, photographing angles that had nothing to do with any legitimate violation I could reasonably identify. I maintained my normal routine as best I could, watering plants, running errands, working from my porch on freelance design projects that were, at this point, almost entirely for show rather than genuine income. Every ordinary action now felt deliberately performed, a careful theater masking the tension underneath. Agent Diaz confirmed quietly that the counter-surveillance van had captured Sentinel Shield's men discussing something in low voices near my mailbox.
Audio too distant to fully transcribe, but tone unmistakably tense. The word tomorrow, repeated twice in a conversation that ended abruptly when a passing car approached.
I understood, reading Diaz's message, that whatever Deborah was planning would likely happen the following day, colliding directly with the Meridian arrest operation now scheduled for that same 48-hour period. Two entirely separate storms, one personal and petty, one federal and enormous, were about to converge violently. I read the message twice, then a third time, before finally setting my phone down and forcing myself to breathe slowly, deliberately, the way training taught. Kessler called that evening with final confirmation. Arrests across the Meridian network, including Frank Kowalski, would execute the following morning at precisely 8 a.m. Coordinated across multiple locations simultaneously to prevent anyone from being tipped off or given time to flee or destroy evidence beforehand. Your cover holds until execution, he said. After that, it doesn't matter anymore. Whatever Sentinel Shield does before 8 tomorrow, our team stays close, but we can't move early without risking the entire operation. I need you to trust the process, Reyes, even if it gets uncomfortable. I told him I understood, though understanding and feeling entirely calm about it were, admittedly, two very different things. I spent that final evening reviewing every document I'd gathered one last time, methodically, the same discipline that had carried me through a decade of far more dangerous undercover work than this. Ray Alvarez's porch light stayed on unusually late that night. A small detail I noticed only because I'd started watching the entire street more carefully than usual. Somewhere behind that light, I suspected, someone else was also preparing, quietly, deliberately, for whatever the following morning would bring. Pam Ellis texted me near midnight, a simple message that read only, "Be careful tomorrow." I mean it. I thanked her, genuinely, recognizing the courage it took for someone so thoroughly intimidated by Deborah to reach out at all, even in something as small as a late-night warning text. I barely slept, running through contingencies the way years of training had conditioned me to, mapping every possible version of what Sentinel Shield's final compliance inspection might actually involve, and reassuring myself, repeatedly, that a full federal team now sat quietly watching every angle of my property. Dawn broke gray and humid over Willow Creek Estates, the kind of thick summer morning that made the whole neighborhood feel slightly unreal, hazy at the edges. I made coffee I barely drank, checked my phone twice for updates from Kessler, and waited, the stillness practically vibrating with anticipation. At 7:15, Diaz confirmed quietly through our secure channel that Sentinel Shield's SUV had left its usual position, moving instead toward the Kowalski house directly, likely for final coordination before whatever they'd planned. I felt my pulse steady into the familiar, focus calm I relied on for exactly moments like this. At 7:40, the surveillance van outside my property confirmed full operational readiness. Cameras rolling continuously, audio equipment active, everything positioned to capture whatever happened next in complete, irrefutable detail. Whatever Deborah Kowalski had planned, it would happen in full view of a professional federal recording team. I stepped onto my front porch at exactly 7:50, coffee mug in hand, deliberately maintaining the exact ordinary routine I'd performed every morning for 11 months, giving Deborah and Sentinel Shield nothing unusual to react to before whatever they intended could unfold naturally. Fully captured, fully documented. The black SUV rounded the corner of Larkspur Lane at 7:53. 2 Sentinel Shield men inside, both wearing navy uniforms with gold shields stitched onto their chests. Styled deliberately close enough to real police that I watched 2 neighbors freeze mid-stride on the sidewalk, uncertain what they were witnessing. Deborah followed close behind in her white SUV, parking directly across the street rather than approaching herself, watching from behind her windshield with the same clipboard she'd carried the very first day we met, though this time she made no move to step out of the vehicle at all. The 2 men approached my porch with exaggerated authority, one holding a tablet displaying what looked like an official-seeming citation form, the other resting his hand deliberately near his hip in a gesture clearly meant to intimidate rather than reflect any actual, legitimate law enforcement equipment or training. "Ma'am, we're here regarding unresolved compliance issues," the first man said, voice pitched loud enough to carry across the street, clearly performing for an audience Deborah had ensured would be watching. "You're required to allow immediate inspection of the property under HOA authority." I stayed calm, coffee mug still in hand. "I'd like to see actual identification and legal authorization for that," I said evenly, the same measured tone I'd used countless times facing far more dangerous men than this. The second man's hand tightened near his hip, his composure visibly rattled by a response he clearly hadn't anticipated or prepared for. I kept my expression carefully neutral, aware that any visible fear would only embolden 2 men clearly performing for an audience they hadn't expected to gather. "You don't get to ask questions," the first man snapped, stepping directly onto my porch steps, closer than any legitimate inspection required. Neighbors had begun gathering now, several with phones raised, recording uncertainly from a distance, unsure whether to intervene in a scene that increasingly resembled something dangerous unfolding in real time. I set my coffee down deliberately on the porch railing and stepped back slightly, creating distance while keeping my hands visible, every instinct from years of training engaging automatically even as the situation remained, for now, primarily verbal rather than physical, tension coiling tighter with every passing second. "This is private property," I said clearly, loud enough for the gathering neighbors and, more importantly, the surveillance van's audio equipment to capture without ambiguity. You have no legal authority here. I'm asking you both to leave immediately. The first man laughed. A short, ugly sound utterly devoid of humor. Deborah said you'd be difficult, he said, glancing briefly toward her SUV, where she remained watching, clipboard still in hand, expression unreadable behind tinted glass. She also said we shouldn't leave until this is resolved. So let's make this easy for everyone. Shall we? He reached toward my arm. I stepped back sharply, but the second man moved faster than expected, grabbing my other arm from behind while the first closed the remaining distance. Both men now physically restraining me on my own front porch. The exact scenario every instinct in me had trained for, though never quite like this. Every second felt stretched thin. The ordinary sounds of the street. A dog barking somewhere. A lawnmower 2 houses down. Oddly sharp and distant all at once. Let go of me, I said firmly. Deliberately not escalating physically despite every capability I possessed to do exactly that. Aware with total clarity that the surveillance van's cameras needed this moment captured precisely as it was. 2 unlicensed men assaulting a resident on private property in broad daylight. A neighbor, one I barely recognized, shouted for them to stop. Phones still raised and recording. Another rushed toward their own porch, presumably calling actual police this time. Deborah's SUV remained parked, unmoving, watching the entire confrontation unfold without any visible attempt to intervene or call it off. The first man's grip tightened painfully around my forearm, dragging me a step further from my door. And for one sharp moment, genuine physical fear cut through my professional composure. A reminder that no amount of training fully erases the vulnerability of being physically overpowered by 2 larger men. Get off my property, I said again. Louder now, deliberately projecting toward the street rather than just the men holding me. Every word calculated for the recording equipment I knew was capturing every syllable from the discreetly parked van less than a block away. Exactly as planned. The second man shoved me forward suddenly, my knee striking the porch step hard enough to send a sharp bolt of pain through my leg. The impact loud enough that several neighbors gasped audibly, phones still raised, capturing a moment that would later prove far more consequential than anyone present yet realized. This is what happens when you don't cooperate, the first man said, voice tight with something between anger and nervous performance, clearly aware now that an audience was watching more closely than he'd anticipated. His earlier confidence visibly fraying at the edges under the weight of public scrutiny. I didn't fight back physically, though every trained instinct screamed to. Instead, I let the moment play out exactly as it was happening, understanding that the footage being captured right now, unedited, undeniable, mattered infinitely more than any physical resistance I could offer against 2 men clearly out of their depth. Sirens became audible in the distance. Real police finally responding to a neighbor's frantic call. The sound seeming to startle both Sentinel Shield men more than anything else that had happened so far. Their grip on my arms loosened slightly, uncertainty replacing the earlier performed authority almost instantly. Deborah's SUV door finally opened, and she stepped out onto the street, expression sharpening into something between alarm and calculation as she watched the sirens approach, clearly recognizing that whatever outcome she'd envisioned for this morning had not accounted for actual law enforcement arriving mid-confrontation. This has gone far enough, she called out, voice suddenly shifting into performed concern. as though she hadn't personally orchestrated the entire encounter from the moment she deployed Sentinel Shield to my porch that morning. The transformation was almost impressive in its speed and shamelessness. The two men released my arms abruptly, stepping back as the first patrol car turned onto Larkspur Lane, red and blue lights cutting through the gray morning haze. I remained standing on my porch, forearm throbbing, knee aching, but entirely, deliberately upright, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me collapse. The responding officers moved quickly, separating the Sentinel Shield men from the gathering crowd of neighbors, several of whom were already talking over each other, recounting what they'd witnessed, phones still recording, voices tight with the particular mixture of shock and vindication that comes from finally seeing proof of something long suspected. One officer approached me directly, asking if I needed medical attention, his tone professional but visibly troubled by what he'd apparently already been briefed on through dispatch. I told him I was fine, though the deep ache in my knee suggested that assessment might prove somewhat optimistic later. Deborah approached the officers next, launching immediately into an explanation about authorized HOA compliance procedures, her composure rapidly rebuilding itself into something resembling righteous confidence, clearly counting on her usual advantage of respectability and community standing to smooth over whatever had just occurred on my front porch. "Ma'am, these men aren't licensed security personnel," the officer said flatly, checking something on his radio. "There's no such thing as authorized HOA compliance procedures that include physical restraint of a resident on private property. This is assault, plain and simple, regardless of what title your organization gave them." Several neighbors nodded along as the officer spoke, the collective relief of people who had waited years for someone to finally say it plainly. Deborah's expression flickered, the first genuine crack in her composure I'd witnessed since the day she'd measured my mailbox post. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, voice tightening slightly. "I simply hired a compliance service. I had no idea they would escalate things this way." The lie sat uneasily in the air. "We have witnesses," the officer said, gesturing toward the gathered neighbors, several already offering their phone footage without being asked. "And based on what we're seeing here, ma'am, this looks a lot less like misunderstanding and a lot more like something that's going to require a much more thorough investigation." I stood quietly through this exchange, allowing the scene to unfold exactly as the evidence dictated, aware that within the black surveillance van a block away, every second of this confrontation, and everything leading up to it, sat captured in far more comprehensive detail than any bystander's shaky phone footage could offer. Ray Alvarez appeared at the edge of the crowd during this moment, watching everything unfold with an expression I finally understood clearly for what it was. Not simple neighborly concern, but the focused, professional attentiveness of someone who had, in fact, been carefully monitoring this exact situation from the very beginning. He caught my eye briefly across the crowded street, gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, and I understood, with sudden total clarity, exactly what that nod confirmed. Whoever Ray Alvarez truly was, he had known far more about what was coming this morning than any retired neighbor reasonably should have. It was a small gesture, barely visible to anyone else watching, but it told me everything I needed to know about how long this had truly been planned. The officers placed both Sentinel Shield men in handcuffs for questioning, their earlier performed authority collapsing completely under the weight of real law enforcement scrutiny. While Deborah stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching her carefully constructed empire of clipboards, fines, and intimidation begin, visibly, to unravel around her. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A single message from Agent Kessler that read simply, "Confirmed. Moving now." What it meant, 8 a.m., had arrived, and somewhere across 3 counties, federal agents were simultaneously executing coordinated arrests against the entire Meridian laundering network, Frank Kowalski included. I watched Deborah's phone light up in her hand moments later, her face draining of color as she read whatever message or notification had just reached her, the timing unmistakable even to someone with no knowledge of the broader operation unfolding entirely separately from her own morning's disaster. "I need to go," she said abruptly to the officer still questioning her, moving toward her SUV with sudden urgency that hadn't been present moments earlier. The officer stepped directly into her path. "Ma'am, we still have questions regarding this morning's incident. You're not free to leave just yet." It was at that moment, watching Deborah's carefully maintained control finally shatter, completely under simultaneous pressure from 2 directions she'd never anticipated colliding, that I decided the time had come to reveal exactly who I really was, and exactly how much I actually knew about everything happening in Willow Creek Estates. I stepped forward, reaching into my pocket for the credentials I'd kept locked away for 11 months, and held them up clearly for the responding officers to see. "Special Agent Maya Reyes, FBI," I said. "I need you to detain Deborah Kowalski. She's connected to an active federal investigation." The street went completely silent, neighbors staring in open shock, phones still raised but forgotten mid-recording, Deborah herself frozen mid-step, staring at my credentials with an expression that finally, fully, cracked from composed authority into something closer to genuine, unmasked fear for the very first time. "That's impossible," she said weakly, though the words carried none of her usual conviction. "You're a graphic designer. You garden." I almost felt something like sympathy watching her scramble for footing in a reality that had just shifted completely beneath her carefully polished shoes. "I've been investigating a money laundering network connected to your husband's business for the past 11 months, I said clearly, deliberately, for the benefit of both the responding officers and the small crowd of stunned neighbors who had, until moments earlier, simply believed they were watching an HOA dispute. Sentinel Shield's payments trace directly back to accounts linked to that same network," I continued. "Your reserve fund embezzlement, your husband's shell companies, this morning's assault, it's all connected, Deborah. And it's all been documented for weeks by a federal surveillance team parked right there on your own street." The crowd had grown considerably by now, more residents stepping out onto their porches, drawn by sirens and raised voices into a scene none of them wanted to miss. I gestured toward the black van, which pulled forward now, no longer discreet, no longer hidden, Agent Diaz stepping out to formally coordinate with local police on securing the scene, confirming publicly what I just revealed with the unmistakable authority of an actual federal operation finally showing itself. Deborah's legs seemed to genuinely weaken beneath her, one of the officers stepping forward to steady her before she could stumble, her earlier icy composure completely gone now, replaced by something raw and unguarded that every resident present would remember for a very long time afterward. Ray Alvarez stepped closer through the crowd, and for the first time since I'd known him, pulled a slim credential wallet from his own jacket pocket, holding it briefly toward me with a small, knowing smile. Retired FBI, Cleveland Field Office, confirming everything I'd suspected but never quite let myself fully believe. I've been keeping an informal eye on this neighborhood for the local field office, he said quietly. Just to me. Old habits. Agent had moved in 3 doors down from a Meridian address. I figured it wasn't entirely coincidence. Good work. By the way, Agent Reyes. I laughed despite everything. A short, disbelieving sound. Understanding suddenly that raised tomatoes, his careful warnings, his quiet, patient presence throughout the entire ordeal, had never been simple neighborly kindness at all. He'd been watching over the investigation, and quietly, over me, the entire time. Somewhere behind his easy laugh, I recognized the particular relief of an agent watching a long, careful operation finally, safely, reach its conclusion. The responding officers formally detained Deborah pending further investigation, reading her rights as neighbors watched in stunned, near total silence. The same woman who'd spent years fining them over mailbox heights and wind chimes now standing handcuffed on the very street she'd once ruled with absolute, unquestioned authority. Across town. Though I wouldn't learn the full details until later that afternoon. Coordinated federal teams executed simultaneous arrests against Frank Kowalski and 11 other individuals connected to the Meridian Holdings network, seizing financial records that would ultimately confirm nearly every theory I'd built over the previous months. Pam Ellis found me on the sidewalk once the crowd began thinning, tears in her eyes, apologizing again for the reports she'd made to Deborah weeks earlier. "You don't owe me anything," I told her honestly. "You were scared." System designed to make good people afraid. Trish, the board member who'd resigned rather than keep enabling Deborah's escalating control, arrived moments later, having heard the commotion from 2 streets over. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly, watching Deborah being placed into the back of a patrol car.
"I just didn't know."
Mr. Slowly, leaning on his cane, watching the scene with an expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet, weary satisfaction. "The mailbox flag," he said softly, almost to himself. "All this time, and it was never really about the mailbox flag at all, was it?" His cane tapped softly against the sidewalk as he spoke, the small sound oddly steady against the general commotion still settling around the street. I confirmed, gently, that it never had been, explaining as much as I legally could about the embezzled reserve fund, the unlicensed enforcement squad, and the laundering network that had used a homeowners association's petty tyranny as convenient cover for something far larger and far more damaging than anyone realized. The 2 Sentinel Shield men, still in handcuffs nearby, offered no resistance now, their earlier performed authority long gone, replaced by the visible realization that impersonating law enforcement and assaulting a federal agent on camera carried consequences considerably steeper than the cash Deborah had promised them for the job. In the weeks that followed, Deborah Kowalski was formally charged with embezzlement, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and orchestrating an unlicensed enforcement operation resulting in assault. The reserve fund evidence I'd gathered quietly for months becoming, at last, formal exhibits in a case far bigger than any HOA dispute. Frank Kowalski, facing separate but related federal charges tied directly to the Meridian network. began cooperating with prosecutors within days. His testimony ultimately corroborating nearly everything Agent Diaz and I had painstakingly pieced together across 11 months of careful, patient surveillance work throughout the neighborhood. The HOA itself was placed under temporary court-appointed oversight, the reserve fund frozen pending a full financial audit, and residents like Mr. Chun and Pam Ellis finally saw years of accumulated disputed fines quietly reversed once the true scale of Deborah's mismanagement became part of the public record. Several residents later told me it was the first HOA meeting in years that actually felt like it belonged to the neighborhood rather than to one woman's clipboard. Trish, encouraged by neighbors who'd watched her quiet resistance from the sidelines, ran for HOA president herself that fall, winning unanimously in an election that looked nothing like the uncontested formality Deborah had enjoyed for 6 consecutive years of unchecked, unquestioned control over Willow Creek estates. I stayed in Willow Creek only a few more weeks after that morning. My cover no longer necessary. My real purpose finally publicly known. Neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid me now waved genuinely, some even apologizing awkwardly for believing, however briefly, whatever Deborah had once told them about me. On my last afternoon on Larkspur Lane, Ray Alvarez brought over one final bag of tomatoes, setting them on my porch step with the same quiet, unassuming care he'd shown from the very beginning. "Good hunting, Agent Reyes," he said, shaking my hand. "This neighborhood's better for what you did here." I promised to keep in touch, and meant it, in the particular way you mean things with people who've quietly watched your back without ever asking for credit. I drove away from Willow Creek Estates with radar asleep in his carrier, the community's matching mailboxes and trimmed hedges shrinking in my rearview mirror, knowing that somewhere behind me, a neighborhood once ruled by fear and clipboards was finally, slowly, learning what it felt like to simply live without watching over its shoulder. Deborah Kowalski, once the woman who fined a widow for a wind chime, now faced years of federal prison time for crimes far larger than anything her own carefully maintained file on me had ever recorded. Undone in the end not by revenge, but by the quiet, patient, undeniable weight of the truth.